Beliefs can be changed through education, what victorious nations owe defeated populations, and how reconciliation happens between former enemies. What we can say with confidence is that the program represented a distinctive American approach to post-war reconstruction. Optimistic about human potential for change, confident in democracy's appeal, willing to invest resources in long-term cultural transformation rather than just short-term security, and committed, at least in principle, to winning hearts and minds through persuasion rather than force. These characteristics would shape American foreign policy for decades. The belief that spreading democratic values serves both idealistic and strategic purposes, that cultural engagement and education can transform societies, that former enemies can become partners through proper re-education. All these ideas that animated the German POW program also influenced American approaches to Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless other interventions. Sometimes this approach worked reasonably well, as in Japan and South Korea. Sometimes it failed spectacularly, as in Vietnam and Iraq. The pattern suggests that successful democratization requires far more than re-education programs or cultural exposure. It requires favorable political conditions, economic reconstruction, security guarantees, patient long-term commitment, and most importantly, domestic populations willing to embrace democratic transformation for their own reasons. The German POW re-education program succeeded to the limited extent it did, because it occurred in a larger context where Germany had been utterly defeated, Nazi ideology thoroughly discredited, economic reconstruction through the Marshall Plan offering hope, and Cold War pressures making democracy attractive relative to Soviet communism. Without these broader conditions, all the De Roof newspapers and Fort Eustis lectures would have accomplished little. The individual human stories within this larger historical process remain compelling. Franz Backer, the Austrian artist who painted New Hampshire landscapes while imprisoned at Camp Stark, whose work still hangs in local homes. Jakob, whose faith in humanity was restored by a 6-day democracy course. Alfred Anders, who went from Dachau concentration camp to Fort Kearny to becoming one of Germany's most important post-war novelists. Hans Werner Richter, who transformed his POW newspaper experience into Group 47, shaping an entire literary generation. Gustav Hauke, who returned to Germany and continued writing, keeping the Der Roof spirit alive in different forms. Robert Pestalozzi and Edward Davison, American officers who believed in redemption and gave prisoners space to transform themselves. The anonymous farmers in Kansas and Texas who invited German prisoners to holiday meals, the guards who shared cigarettes and talked baseball, the townspeople who brought small gifts to camps, the American families who saw young German soldiers as someone's son rather than as enemies deserving punishment. These countless small acts of human decency accumulated into something larger than any re-education curriculum could achieve. They demonstrated through lived experience that former enemies could recognize each other's humanity, that reconciliation was possible, that a different future could be imagined and built. When Willy Yeager wrote his letter in 1991 thanking Americans for treating prisoners as humans, he was acknowledging this simple but profound truth. Kindness matters. Generosity transforms. Recognition of shared humanity creates bonds that transcend the hatreds war generates. Military victory defeated Nazi Germany, but human decency helped ensure that defeat led toward democracy rather than toward resentment and future conflict. The story of German POW re-education in the United States during World War II isn't a simple tale of American triumph or comprehensive success in transforming enemy minds. It's a complex, nuanced account of limited achievement within larger processes, of small victories amid frustrations, of human connections that mattered even when ideological conversion failed, of cultural seeds planted that would take decades to flower in unexpected ways. It's a story about the power and limits of education, about what victors owe the defeated, about how reconciliation begins even before wars end. about ideas and culture as tools of transformation, about the gap between intentions and outcomes, about individual lives changed and larger histories flowing through them. Most of all, it's a reminder that historical processes unfold through countless individual choices and encounters, through prisoners reading banned books in camp libraries, through guards sharing moments of conversation, through townspeople extending unexpected kindness, through writers and artists finding voice despite captivity, through American officials believing ideas could matter as much as weapons, and through ordinary people on both sides recognizing that enemies are also humans, worthy of dignity and capable of change. The Idea Factory at Fort Kearny closed in April 1946. The buildings were repurposed or demolished. The barracks where Der Ruf was produced disappeared. The beach where prisoners swam is now part of a university campus, where students walk unaware of the history beneath their feet. But the ideas generated there, the connections forged, the literary movement it helped spawn, the democratic values it promoted however imperfectly, and the human transformations it facilitated in some prisoners' lives. These legacies endure in ways both traceable and invisible, shaping the post-war world in small but real ways that ripple forward even now, 80 years later, reminding us that how we treat those we've defeated matters as much as the victory itself. Afghanistan, echoes of the German POW re-education philosophy could be heard. The belief that exposing people to democratic values and American culture would create lasting change remained powerful even when evidence suggested the process was far more complicated and less reliably successful than advocates hoped. The mixed results and unintended consequences of the German POW re-education program actually make it more valuable as a historical case study. If it had been an unambiguous success or obvious failure, the lessons would be simpler but less interesting. Instead, we see a complex interaction between intentions and outcomes, between ideology and practice, between high-minded goals and practical limitations. The American professors who designed the program genuinely believed in education's transformative power. They were mostly humanities scholars who saw re-education as a chance to validate liberal arts education at a moment when science and technology dominated. Ron Robin, the historian most critical of the program, argues this academic self-interest distorted the effort. Professors created a curriculum that reflected their intellectual interests rather than what would actually reach ordinary German soldiers. Der Ruf's literary sophistication, the emphasis on high culture, the philosophical discussions, all these appealed to fellow intellectuals but meant less to soldiers whose main concerns were survival, family, and getting home. There's truth to this criticism, but it also misses something important. The point wasn't to reach every prisoner equally. It was to reach influential prisoners who could themselves reach others, to create what we'd now call thought leaders who might shape post-war German discourse. By that standard, focusing on intellectuals made sense even if it meant ordinary soldiers were less engaged. The tension between mass appeal and elite influence ran through the entire program and was never fully resolved. Different components made different choices. Der Ruf aimed high culturally, betting on influence through quality. Fort Eustis aimed for mass exposure through rapid processing. Films and books tried to split the difference, using accessible content with democratic messages. What united all these efforts was faith that ideas mattered, that exposure to democratic culture and accurate information could undermine totalitarian ideology. In the long run, this faith was at least partially validated, not because lectures converted prisoners, but because the cumulative experience of living in a democratic society, even as prisoners, demonstrated that alternatives to totalitarianism could work. The library access that let prisoners read books banned under Nazi censorship mattered enormously. In an article for Der Ruf, Kurt Vince wrote about discovering works by Erich Maria Remarque, Thomas Mann, and Franz Werfel, authors whose books had been burned in Nazi Germany. Had we only had the opportunity to read these books before, Vince wrote, our introduction to life, war, and the expanse of politics would have been different. This suggests that access to banned literature did exactly what American officials hoped. It challenged Nazi narratives and offered alternative perspectives that many prisoners had never encountered. The books available in POW camp libraries weren't American propaganda. They were German literature that the Nazis had suppressed precisely because it contradicted their ideology. Remarks All Quiet on the Western Front, a devastating anti-war novel, showed the horror and futility of World War I from a German soldier's perspective. Mann's work explored German culture and history with sophistication that Nazi propaganda couldn't match. Werfel's novels addressed human dignity and spiritual questions. These were German voices, not American ones, and that made them more credible to German prisoners. The genius of this approach was letting banned German culture argue against Nazism rather than having Americans lecture. Similarly, the decision to have anti-Nazi German prisoners write and produce Der Ruf themselves, rather than having American officers write propaganda, gave the newspaper credibility. When Gustav Hocke or Alfred Andersch criticized Nazi ideology in Der Ruf's pages, they were Germans criticizing their own country's recent history. This carried weight that American propaganda never could. The program's greatest weakness was probably time. By the time re-education seriously began in early 1945, Germany's defeat was weeks away. The vast majority of prisoners spent less than 2 years in American captivity, many far less. Fort Eustis tried to cram comprehensive democratic education into 6 days. Even Fort Getty's 8-week course was incredibly short for attempting to change political beliefs formed over lifetimes. If re-education had begun earlier, if prisoners had spent more years exposed to democratic culture, outcomes might have been different. But earlier, re-education would have violated Geneva Convention concerns about propaganda and risked German retaliation against American POWs. The program's late start was partly strategic caution, partly bureaucratic delay, and partly because American authorities only gradually recognized the need. By the time everything was in place, the war was almost over. Another complication was that many German prisoners actually wanted to stay in the United States after the war, but weren't allowed. They'd seen American prosperity, made friends, developed work relationships, and preferred the idea of starting over in America to returning to Germany's ruins. The War Department insisted on repatriation, maintaining that prisoners had to go home even if home was devastated. About 5,000 former POWs did eventually emigrate to America legally after repatriation, going through proper immigration channels once they were no longer prisoners. Thousands more visited as tourists in later years. The emotional connections formed during captivity endured. Reunions between former prisoners and American guards or host families continued for decades. One particularly poignant reunion occurred in 1986 when Camp Stark, the New Hampshire logging camp, organized a gathering of former guards and prisoners 40 years after the war. 5 former German POWs traveled back to New Hampshire to see the campsite and reconnect with townspeople who remembered them. These elderly Germans walked through Stark looking for places they'd worked, homes where they'd painted portraits, spots where they'd stood decades earlier as young prisoners. The reunion demonstrated how thoroughly former enemies had become friends, how American generosity during captivity had created lasting bonds that transcended the war's hatred. Similar reunions occurred at other campsites. Former prisoners returned to Kansas farming communities where they'd worked harvests, to Texas towns where they'd built roads, to Rhode Island to see where Fort Kearny had stood before it was absorbed into the University of Rhode Island Bay campus. These pilgrimages mixed nostalgia with survivors' guilt and gratitude. The men remembered being well-fed prisoners while their families starved in Germany, remembered being treated humanely when they'd expected harsh punishment, remembered Americans who'd shown kindness to enemies. The historical legacy of the POW re-education program remains contested and complicated. Scholars continue debating whether it succeeded or failed, whether its impact was significant or marginal, whether the approach was ethical or problematic. These debates matter because they touch on fundamental questions about how societies transform after conflict, whether political. Others, like Hans Werner Richter and Alfred Anders, pursued their vision of using literature and journalism to shape German cultural reconstruction. Their post-war Der Ruf newspaper, launched in August 1946, advocated for what they called the young generation, Germans who'd been too young to be responsible for Nazi crimes but would have to build the new Germany. The newspaper criticized both Nazi remnants and Allied occupation policies that seemed heavy-handed or unjust. This critical independence reflected democratic values the editors had absorbed, the idea that free press should question authority and speak truth to power. But it also got them in trouble. As Cold War tensions escalated in 1947 and American occupation authorities became less tolerant of criticism, Anders and Richter found themselves censored and eventually removed from their own newspaper. The irony was bitter. They'd been re-educated in democracy by Americans who'd emphasized free speech and critical thinking. Now American occupation authorities were shutting down their newspaper for being too critical. The editors understood this wasn't a failure of democratic principles, but a demonstration of how those principles get compromised when power and security concerns override idealistic commitments. Their response was to found Group 47, a private literary circle that couldn't be as easily controlled by occupation authorities. The meetings, held in informal settings like country inns, brought together young German writers to read work aloud and receive criticism from peers. There was no formal membership, no constitution, no headquarters, just Richter's invitation list, and a commitment to honest, rigorous literary evaluation. Group 47's influence grew slowly through the late 1940s and exploded in the 1950s as post-war German literature found its voice. Writers who'd cut their teeth in Group 47 sessions went on to define German letters for generations. Heinrich Böll, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1972, credited the group with nurturing his development. Günter Grass, another Nobel laureate, emerged from Group 47 circles. The roster of participants reads like a who's who of post-war German literature. Connecting this literary movement directly to Fort Kearny and POW re-education would be simplistic. Many factors shaped Group 47's formation and success. But the connection isn't coincidental either. Anders and Richter's experiences as POWs, their work on Der Ruf in Rhode Island, their exposure to American democratic culture and literary traditions, and their determination to create free intellectual spaces in post-war Germany all flowed directly from their captivity experiences. Fort Kearny didn't make them writers, but it gave them tools, connections, and confidence to pursue their literary and democratic visions. The American officers who'd supervised Der Ruf production maintained contact with some former prisoners. Edward Davison, who'd led the Special Projects Division, corresponded with several Fort Kearny alumni after the war. He collected their letters, testimonials, and publications, perhaps seeking validation that his controversial program had mattered. When Davison died in 1970, his papers went to Yale University, where they remain a crucial source for understanding the re-education program. Robert Pestalozzi, the Swiss-American lieutenant who'd worked closely with Der Ruf editors, also stayed in touch with former prisoners. They remembered him with genuine affection, rare for relationships between captives and captors. Pestalozzi's respect for the German prisoners' intelligence and dignity, his willingness to engage them as intellectual equals rather than defeated enemies, had created bonds that transcended the war. There's a broader question of whether POW re-education contributed to German democratization is impossible to answer, definitively because we can't run the counterfactual experiment. We can't know what would have happened without the program. What we do know is that West Germany did become a stable, prosperous democracy, one of America's closest allies, and a pillar of European integration. Multiple factors produced this outcome: military defeat and occupation, Economic recovery through the Marshall Plan, Cold War pressures that made West Germany strategically vital, generational change as younger Germans rejected Nazi ideology, and German people's own determination to build something better. The 400,000 German POWs who passed through American camps were a tiny fraction of Germany's population. Even if every single one had been successfully re-educated, which they weren't, they couldn't have transformed an entire society alone. But social change doesn't require everyone to change simultaneously. It requires critical masses of influential people in key positions who can shift institutions, culture, and public discourse. The Fort Kearny alumni who became writers, journalists, educators, and administrators represented exactly this kind of influential minority. They occupied positions where their democratic commitments could ripple outward. A journalist who'd learned about free press at Fort Getty would hire young reporters and shape coverage. A teacher who'd studied American democracy at Fort Eustis would influence hundreds of students. An administrator who'd absorbed democratic values through POW re-education would make different decisions than a hardcore Nazi would have made. These indirect long-term effects are nearly impossible to measure, but potentially quite significant. There's also the symbolic importance of the program itself, the fact that it happened at all. The United States could have simply warehoused German prisoners under minimal conditions, avoided any ideological engagement, and repatriated them as quickly as possible. Instead, American authorities invested significant resources in trying to change prisoners' minds through education and culture rather than force. This approach reflected American liberal values and self-conception. We believe in the power of ideas, in persuasion over coercion, in education as transformation. Whether the re-education program validated these beliefs or revealed their limitations remains debated. What's undeniable is that treating prisoners humanely, giving them access to banned literature and honest information, and attempting intellectual engagement rather than simple punishment, created goodwill that paid diplomatic dividends for decades. Former German POWs became some of America's best advocates in post-war Germany precisely because their personal experiences contradicted Nazi propaganda about American barbarity. When Willie Yeager wrote to that Kansas newspaper in 1991, 46 years after the war ended, thanking Americans for treating prisoners humanely, he was part of a larger pattern. Thousands of former POWs maintained positive feelings about the United States throughout their lives, visited America as tourists, encouraged their children to study in American universities, and supported strong German-American relations. These soft power benefits are hard to quantify but unquestionably real. The re-education program also influenced how Americans thought about post-war reconstruction. The idea that you could transform former enemies into democratic partners through education and cultural engagement, rather than just military occupation and punishment, became a template that influenced later American foreign policy. When the United States engaged in nation-building efforts in Japan, South Korea, and eventually Iraq, and perfect! Now I'll create an original, well-researched one-hour script about the real German POW re-education program. This will be completely compliant with YouTube's policies while being even more fascinating than fiction, because it actually happened. For a one-hour video at conversational narration pace, you need approximately 9,000, 10,000 words. I'll create a comprehensive script that's unique, engaging, and based entirely on documented history. The winter sun hung low over Narragansett Bay in February 1945 as a truck carrying 20 German prisoners wound its way through Rhode Island's coastal roads toward a destination that would change their lives and perhaps the future of an entire nation. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war being shipped to another labor camp to pick cotton or harvest wheat. These men, intellectuals, writers, artists, teachers who had been plucked from POW camps across America, were about to become part of one of World War II's most audacious and controversial experiments, a secret program to re-educate Hitler's soldiers and turn enemies into Democrats. The United States held over 380,000 German prisoners of war during World War II, scattered across 700 camps in nearly every state. Yet most Americans had no idea they were there. The government deliberately kept their presence quiet, both to comply with Geneva Convention requirements and to avoid public panic about having hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers on American soil. But what remained even more secret was what American military planners intended to do with these prisoners. Not just hold them until the war ended, but attempt something unprecedented in military history: transform their political beliefs, challenge the Nazi ideology many had absorbed, and prepare them to return to Germany as apostles of democracy. This is the true story of the Idea Factory: Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, Fort Getty in Jamestown, Fort Eustis in Virginia, and the remarkable German prisoners who helped publish a newspaper that would reach POW camps nationwide, challenge Nazi propaganda from within, and lay the groundwork for one of the most influential literary movements in post-war German history. It's a story of intellectual warfare, cultural transformation, and the complicated process of changing hearts and minds when military victory alone isn't enough. The American plan to re-educate German POWs didn't emerge from careful pre-war strategy. In fact, when the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the War Department had barely considered what to do with prisoners at all. During World War I, only about 1,300 German naval personnel had been held in the United States, with most POWs remaining in Europe. 20 years later, military planners assumed America's allies would again handle the bulk of captured enemy soldiers. They were catastrophically wrong. The surrender of General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps in Tunisia in May 1943 changed everything. Suddenly, over 150,000 German and Italian prisoners needed somewhere to go, and Britain, already housing nearly 250,000 POWs and dealing with severe overcrowding, couldn't take them. The prisoners began arriving in American ports by the shipload, and the United States scrambled to build camps, train guards, and figure out what to do with an enemy population that would eventually exceed 400,000 men. The camps sprang up everywhere: in Texas and Kansas, Michigan and Virginia, California and New York, often near small rural towns where labor shortages made prisoner work valuable. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear rules. Prisoners must receive adequate food, shelter, medical care, and the opportunity for recreation and education. Enlisted men could be required to work for wages comparable to local standards. Officers could not be forced to work. Treatment had to be humane. In return, the United States hoped Germany would treat captured American soldiers with similar decency. By 1944, the War Department faced a growing problem inside these camps. Violence between Nazi loyalists and anti-Nazi prisoners had turned some facilities into battlegrounds. Hardcore Nazis, often submarine crews or SS members, intimidated other prisoners, conducted kangaroo courts, and occasionally murdered fellow Germans suspected of anti-Nazi sympathies. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a suspected anti-Nazi prisoner was beaten to death by fellow POWs in November 1943. Similar incidents occurred elsewhere as fanatical Nazis maintained rigid control through fear. Eleanor Roosevelt learned about the violence from military personnel and expressed concern directly to President Franklin Roosevelt. Her intervention helped revive a re-education proposal that General S.L.A. Marshall had developed, but which had been rejected as impractical. By March 1944, key officials, including Secretary of War Henry Stimson and the new Provost Marshal General Archer Lurch, recognized something had to change. The most dangerous Nazi leaders were segregated to Camp Alva in Oklahoma, a facility designated for hardcore ideologues. But isolation alone wasn't enough. What if, military planners wondered, we could actually change how these prisoners thought? Not through torture or brainwashing, but through exposure to ideas, literature, and democratic values they'd been denied under Nazi censorship. The concept was controversial from the start. The Geneva Convention prohibited exposing prisoners to propaganda. American officials worried about German retaliation against captured American soldiers. Many in the military thought attempting to change adult political beliefs was impossible. Others feared successful re-education might just turn prisoners into communists instead of Democrats. Most American professors recruited to help had zero understanding of German culture, military life, or prison dynamics. Yet despite these obstacles, in fall 1944, the Office of the Provost Marshal General established the Special Projects Division, a small unit tasked with attempting the impossible. Leading the effort was Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, a British-born professor and poet who'd been working in the Army's Morale Division. Davison was an idealist who believed in the power of ideas and culture to transform political consciousness. He assembled a team that included German-speaking American officers and German émigrés who had fled Nazi persecution, people who understood both German culture and why democracy mattered. The plan they developed had several components. First, stock POW camp libraries with books banned in Nazi Germany, works by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Franz Werfel, and other authors whose writing challenged totalitarian thinking. Second, show carefully selected films that portrayed American life honestly, without obvious propaganda. Third, and most ambitiously, create a German-language newspaper written by anti-Nazi prisoners themselves that could reach POWs nationwide with accurate war reporting, cultural commentary, and democratic ideas presented by fellow Germans rather than American propagandists. The challenge was finding the right prisoners to help. American interrogators had questioned thousands of captured Germans, looking for intelligence about troop movements, equipment, and military plans. But they'd also been noting political attitudes, asking prisoners what they thought about Hitler, the Nazi Party, and the war. Some POWs were committed Nazis who refused to cooperate. Others were apolitical conscripts who just wanted to survive. But a small percentage, maybe 15%, had expressed anti-Nazi sentiments, disgust with Hitler's regime, or willingness to imagine a different Germany. These were the men Davison needed. The hunt went out through interrogation records and camp reports for prisoners with intellectual credentials and democratic leanings. Teachers, journalists, artists, professors, anyone with education and writing ability who'd shown they weren't Nazi true believers. One by one, they were identified and quietly transferred without explanation to special camps. Some thought they were being singled out for punishment. Alfred Anders, who would become one of post-war Germany's most important novelists, had been imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp before being forced into military service. Captured in Italy in 1944, he'd been sent to an anti-Nazi POW camp in Louisiana. When guards suddenly ordered him transported to an unknown destination in February 1945, Anders feared he was being sent back to hardline Nazis who would kill him for his political views. The truck arrived at night at a coastal installation in Rhode Island, and Anders stepped out expecting the worst. Instead, he found himself greeted by fellow anti-Nazi prisoners he'd known, artists like Franz Wisniewski and writers like Kurt Vinz, all smiling at what looked like a resort compared to typical POW camps. Anders, usually stoic, had tears in his eyes. "Welcome to Fort Kearny," someone said. "Welcome to the Idea Factory." Fort Kearny sat on a beautiful piece of Narragansett Bay waterfront that is now the University of Rhode Island's Bay campus. The installation had been established during World War I and contained simple barracks, administrative buildings, a kitchen, and recreation areas. But what made it different from every other POW camp wasn't the facilities. It was the atmosphere. There were no guard towers. The perimeter had barbed wire, but military police walked the grounds unarmed. Prisoners weren't addressed by rank, but as Mr., a mark of respect that shocked men accustomed to military hierarchy. Inspections were minimal. Recreation was generous. The prisoners had access to beaches on the bay, time to read, write, paint, and discuss politics and culture with both fellow Germans and American officers. Several American supervisors spoke fluent German and engaged prisoners in long philosophical debates about democracy, culture, and Germany's future. The catch, such as it was, came on arrival. Prisoners had to renounce their German military ranks and sign a declaration stating they owed no loyalty to the Nazi Party or Hitler, believed in democracy, would refrain from activities detrimental to the United States, and wouldn't try to escape. For anti-Nazi prisoners, this was easy. Many had been waiting for years to openly express their hatred of Hitler's regime without fearing fellow prisoners would beat or kill them. Despite the minimal security and coastal location ideal for escape, not a single prisoner at Fort Kearny ever tried to run. They didn't want to leave. Life at the Idea Factory was, as one prisoner later described it, probably unique in human history. A place where enemies voluntarily worked to undermine the ideology of their own former government. The main mission was producing Der Ruf, The Call, a German-language newspaper that would be distributed to POW camps nationwide. The name carried symbolic weight. It was a call to German prisoners to rethink their assumptions, question Nazi propaganda, and imagine a different future. The first editor-in-chief was Dr. Gustav René Hauke, a prize-winning novelist and newspaper correspondent who'd been forced to serve as a civilian interpreter for the German army in Sicily before capture in September 1944. Hauke assembled an editorial staff of talented prisoners. Alfred Anders brought literary sophistication and anti-fascist credentials earned through Dachau imprisonment. Hans Werner Richter, who would later found the famous Group 47 literary movement, contributed sharp political analysis and a gift for reaching ordinary readers. Kurt Vins handled production editing with meticulous attention to detail. Franz Wisniewski designed graphics and illustrations that made Der Ruf visually appealing. The American supervisors gave them remarkable freedom. Captain Walter Schoenstedt, a German leftist émigré who'd become a U.S. Army officer, oversaw production but encouraged independent thinking and rarely censored content. Lieutenant Robert Pestalozzi, a Swiss-American who spoke perfect German, worked closely with the editorial staff and earned their genuine affection through respect and fair treatment. War Department and State Department officials reviewed draft English translations before publication, but they rarely demanded changes. The goal wasn't to create obvious American propaganda, which prisoners would immediately reject. Instead, Der Ruf would present itself as a German newspaper written by Germans for Germans, offering perspectives that Nazi censorship had suppressed. The first issue appeared on March 1, 1945, with a print run of 11,000 copies distributed to 134 POW camps. It created an immediate sensation. At some camps, Nazi loyalists bought copies and publicly burned them, calling Der Ruf Jewish propaganda not fit for men. They threatened fellow prisoners who tried to purchase the newspaper. But at other camps, the paper sold out within minutes, with prisoners passing dog-eared copies from bunk to bunk and writing hundreds of letters to the editorial staff. What made Der Ruf effective wasn't heavy-handed propaganda, but honest, high-quality journalism on topics POWs cared about. It reported accurate war news at a time when Nazi-controlled camp newspapers still claimed Germany was winning. It published excerpts from banned German literature that prisoners remembered from before the war. It ran thoughtful essays on German culture, democracy, and what rebuilding might require. It featured letters from prisoners nationwide debating politics, philosophy, and Germany's future. One of the most powerful weapons Der Ruf deployed was simply truth. By spring 1945, Germany's defeat was obvious to anyone paying attention. But Nazi diehards in POW camps still claimed victory was imminent, that secret weapons would turn the tide, that the Western Allies would collapse. Der Ruf systematically dismantled these fantasies with factual reporting about Allied advances, German cities falling, the Soviets closing on Berlin. One unbelieving Nazi prisoner wrote to complain about an article stating Hitler had declared war on the United States, which of course he had done days after Pearl Harbor. "I wonder whether you can't lie any better," the prisoner wrote. So deep was his indoctrination. But other letters showed minds opening. Private Herbert Diedler, held at Camp Cook in California, wrote praising the objective, reasonable, and unsparing judgment about events of recent years, the frank description of the present situation, and the wise preparation for things which rebuilding our homeland will demand of us. The newspaper also tackled the most difficult subject of all, the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities. As camps were liberated in early 1945, Der Ruf published accounts of concentration camp horrors. Many German POWs simply refused to believe these reports, dismissing them as Allied propaganda. The cognitive dissonance was too great. How could the Germany they loved, the military they'd served, have committed such crimes? Yet Der Ruf persisted in confronting readers with evidence, not to shame them personally, but to establish that Germany's moral reckoning couldn't be avoided. The literary quality of Der Ruf was deliberately highbrow. American supervisors and the German editorial staff made a conscious choice to write for educated readers rather than aim for mass appeal. The reasoning was that intellectual elites in each camp might influence less literate prisoners if Der Ruf established credibility with opinion leaders. In retrospect, this was both a strength and weakness. The newspaper's sophisticated style earned respect from educated POWs and demonstrated that Germans who opposed Nazism weren't simple propagandists, but serious thinkers. However, the intellectual focus also meant many ordinary soldiers found the paper too academic, too concerned with literature and philosophy, when they just wanted basic news and entertainment. By the time Der Ruf ceased publication in April 1946, circulation had grown to 75,000 copies per issue. It had become profitable, an irony not lost on American officials who'd feared giving it away would make prisoners suspicious. The newspaper achieved something remarkable. At one point in early 1945, monitors found that 75% of POW camp newspapers showed Nazi influence or outright propaganda. By fall 1945, after months of Der Ruf circulation and the reality of German defeat, only one camp newspaper out of 80 examined still promoted Nazi ideology. The shift wasn't just Der Ruf's doing. Military defeat matters more than any propaganda. But the newspaper had provided an alternative narrative and given anti-Nazi prisoners something to rally around. While Der Ruf was Fort Kearny's most visible project, the prisoners there had other crucial missions. They monitored newspapers and reading materials proposed for other camps, screening out both Nazi propaganda and material so obviously pro-American it would backfire. They translated classic American novels into German, works by Steinbeck, Hemingway, and others that sold remarkably well in camp canteens. They reviewed hundreds of films and radio programs, advising American officials which ones would be effective. Interestingly, they recommended against obviously propagandistic content and also against films showing America's dark side. Like gangster movies, anything Nazis could use to claim American culture was violent or corrupt. They even vetoed films with bad acting or weak plots, knowing Nazi prisoners would use poor quality as evidence of American cultural inferiority. The work was intense, but prisoners threw themselves into it. After years of war, captivity, and being forced to serve a regime many despised, they'd found purpose in trying to shape a better post-war Germany. The mood at Fort Kearny was simultaneously serious and light-hearted. Prisoners spent hours in passionate political debates, discussing what democracy really meant, how Germany had gone so wrong, what structures might prevent future catastrophes. But they also enjoyed simple pleasures, swimming in Narragansett Bay, painting watercolors of the Rhode Island coast, organizing art exhibitions with works borrowed from the Rhode Island School of Design Museum in Providence. American officers sometimes visited local families for dinner, bringing stories of the unusual prison camp on the bay. The Sheldon sisters, Lulu and Betty, whose family had a summer home in nearby Saunderstown, remembered officers visiting for meals where Captain Kunzig played piano. Lieutenant Pestalozzi played accordion, and everyone sang together. Lulu Sheldon recalled sailing her small boat one day and encountering a prisoner swimming far from shore who called out a cheerful Guten Tag. She waved back, amused by the thought that he could have theoretically escaped in her boat, but clearly had no interest in leaving. Not every prisoner found Fort Kearny idyllic. The editorial staff of Der Ruf, after months of intensive work, began feeling restless and trapped. On June 28, 1945, they submitted a petition signed by Hocke, Anders, and others complaining that they couldn't accurately portray American society when they'd seen nothing of America except prison camps. They wanted to interact with American civilians, visit cities, experience the democracy they were supposed to be promoting. The real reason, though, was simpler and more human. Germany had surrendered in May. These men desperately wanted to go home, find out if their families had survived the war, and help rebuild their shattered country. Instead, they watched other prisoners getting repatriated while they remained behind to continue training work. Hocke in particular expressed frustration that after 10 issues, Der Ruf couldn't maintain its quality behind barbed wire. The military authorities sympathized, but needed the newspaper to continue. They began recruiting new editorial staff to replace the original team, allowing Hocke and the first generation to finally go home. Hans Werner Richter arrived at Fort Kearny in September 1945 as part of this second wave of editors and writers. He and others maintained Der Ruf through its final issue in March 1946. By then, the urgency had passed. The war had ended. Repatriation was underway. The secret re-education program's existence had been revealed in newspapers. The need for a clandestine POW newspaper had evaporated. But Fort Kearny's legacy was just beginning. When Anders and Richter returned to Germany, they founded a new newspaper, also called Der Ruf, which became a platform for arguing that Germany's complete defeat offered a chance to rebuild society from scratch, creating a peaceful, democratic European order. The Allied authorities initially supported this vision, but as Cold War tensions grew and Anders and Richter became increasingly critical of Allied occupation policies, American censors shut down their newspaper in 1947. Undeterred, the two writers responded by founding Group 47, one of the most influential literary movements in post-war German history. For decades, Group 47 dominated German letters, providing a forum where young writers could present work and receive criticism from peers. The group nourished talents including Nobel Prize winners Heinrich Böll and Günter Grass. Its impact on post-war German literature and intellectual life was immeasurable. A direct line from a secret POW camp in Rhode Island to the cultural reconstruction of democratic Germany. Fort Kearny represented the intellectual heart of the re-education program, but it was deliberately small, housing fewer than 100 prisoners at peak. To reach larger numbers, American officials established additional facilities. Fort Getty and Fort Wetherill, both in Jamestown, Rhode Island, offered more intensive courses for selected prisoners. These programs ran for 8 weeks and provided structured education in American history, government, economics, and culture. The teaching staff included impressive American academics who volunteered for the program. T.V. Smith, a University of Chicago philosophy professor, former congressman, and popular radio host, taught American history with a frankness that shocked German students. He emphasized how American democracy successfully resolved conflicts through compromise rather than violence, contrasting this with German traditions of following strong leaders who imposed solutions. But Smith also criticized failures like the Civil War, which he described as American democracy's great breakdown. German students, raised in a culture where criticizing one's own country was dangerous, were amazed at this honesty. One prisoner later recalled being stunned by the openness with which all topics were discussed, even black points in American history. Smith deliberately wanted students to let their guards down and think critically. When he entered the classroom on the first day and saw German prisoners standing at attention and clicking their heels as they'd been trained, he immediately told them to stop, to sit casually, to treat the course as a discussion among equals rather than military indoctrination. This approach, informal and democratic in style, was itself a lesson in how American culture differed from authoritarian German traditions. The courses at Fort Getty and Wetherill made deep impressions. Over 100 to 200 carefully selected prisoners cycled through the 8-week program. Many later reported it had fundamentally changed their thinking. Jacob, one graduate, said Fort Eustis, a later program, is the greatest thing that ever happened to me. An experience that you remember for a lifetime. Eustis restored my faith in God and man. It's not only what was taught, but the fact that the school existed in the first place. Only the United States could have created such a place. The challenge with Fort Getty and Wetherill was scale. With only 100 graduates by late 1945 and hundreds of thousands of prisoners needing repatriation, the program couldn't reach enough people. Most German POWs would return home without any formal re-education. This troubled Lieutenant Colonel Davison and other officials who'd invested so much in the program. They needed something bigger, faster, and more ambitious. The solution was Fort Eustis, Virginia. Fort Eustis was a large Army base that could accommodate thousands of students. In January 1946, it began offering a rapid 6-day course that attempted to compress the 8-week Fort Getty curriculum into less than a week. The idea was to give as many prisoners as possible at least some exposure to democratic ideas before they shipped home. Starting on January 4, 1946, and continuing through April 1946, Fort Eustis processed over 23,000 German prisoners through its democracy crash course. The program was intense and overwhelming. Prisoners attended lectures on American government, economics, history, and culture. They watched films and discussed what democratic values meant in practice. Instructors emphasized critical thinking, encouraging prisoners to question authority and make independent decisions rather than just following orders. The course's central message was captured in one teacher's admonition that stuck with students. It is a sin against the Holy Ghost to let others think and decide for you. Lieutenant Colonel Alpheus Smith, who had helped run the Fort Getty program before transferring to Fort Eustis, set the tone in his opening address. He admitted, much to students' shocked surprise, that American democracy wasn't perfect. This honesty, so different from Nazi propaganda's insistence on German perfection, itself became a powerful teaching tool. Critics later called Fort Eustis well-meaning incompetence, or clearly a fiasco, arguing that 6 days couldn't possibly change deeply held political beliefs. They were probably right. Surveys of prisoners before repatriation found that while 74% left with appreciation for democracy and friendly attitudes toward their captors, most hadn't fundamentally altered their worldviews. The vast majority of German prisoners left American custody with the same political beliefs they'd arrived with. The real education came not from lectures, but from lived experience. What actually changed many prisoners' minds wasn't courses or newspapers, but the simple experience of being treated humanely by a country they'd been told was a cultural wasteland run by gangsters and plutocrats. German prisoners in the United States ate better food than most had seen during the war. They received medical care equal to what American soldiers received. They could buy snacks and reading materials in camp canteens using wages earned from work details. They played sports, staged theatrical performances, attended religious services, and subscribed to American newspapers. Americans living near camps often invited prisoners to homes for holiday meals, especially in rural areas where German labor helped bring in harvests. Farmers paid the prevailing wage for agricultural work. And while some complained that prisoners didn't work as hard as civilian laborers, others developed genuine friendships with German POWs who showed skill and dedication. A November 1943 poll found that 74% of Americans blamed the German government, not individual Germans, for the war. This relatively benevolent attitude meant prisoners encountered less hostility than they'd expected. Many Americans, particularly those with German ancestry themselves, treated POWs as unfortunate soldiers caught in circumstances beyond their control rather than evil Nazis deserving punishment. The contrast with Nazi propaganda was overwhelming. Prisoners had been told America was barbaric, racially inferior, culturally bankrupt. Instead, they found a wealthy country with functioning democracy, vibrant culture, and people who treated enemies with fairness. Kurt Vins, who worked on Der Ruf, wrote in the newspaper, "Had we only had the opportunity to read these books before," referring to banned literature available in camp libraries, "our introduction to life, war, and the expanse of politics would have been different." The re-education program's greatest success wasn't changing political ideology through lectures. It was simply allowing prisoners to see an alternative to totalitarianism working in practice. Former POW Willie O. Yeager wrote to a Kansas newspaper in 1991 expressing thanks to Americans who were kind to us, who didn't treat us as enemies or Nazi criminals, but as humans. In the long run, this was a much better way to make us friends of the Americans, working better than any re-education. That simple human decency, repeated across hundreds of camps and hundreds of thousands of interactions, probably did more to undermine faith in Nazi ideology than any newspaper or classroom course. The program had significant limitations and contradictions. The most glaring was American racism. Black American soldiers often guarded German POWs and worked alongside them in labor details. These guards and workers witnessed something infuriating and demoralizing. In the segregated South, white German enemy soldiers were allowed access to whites-only facilities, restaurants, trains, and public spaces that Black American citizens were barred from entering. German POWs could swim at segregated beaches, eat in segregated restaurants, and ride in whites-only train cars while their Black American guards had to use separate, inferior facilities. The message was unmistakable. In America's racial hierarchy, even enemy white soldiers ranked above Black American citizens. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. Matthias Rice, a scholar who studied the interaction between German POWs and Black Americans, found that surprisingly little conflict occurred between the two groups. Instead, forms of solidarity and mutual sympathy often developed. Both felt like second-class visitors and second-class citizens, as one description put it. German POWs doing backbreaking Negro work like cotton picking and logging found common cause with Black laborers performing the same tasks. For German prisoners, witnessing American racism provided a powerful education, though not the kind re-education officials intended. Those put to work alongside Black Americans in conditions of shared hardship often had their racial assumptions challenged. The Nazi ideology they'd been taught emphasized Aryan superiority and portrayed Black people as inferior. But working side by side, German POWs discovered that Black Americans were neither inferior nor the caricatures Nazi propaganda had painted. Rice argues this experience changed many prisoners' racial outlook and undermined assumptions that underpinned Nazi ideology. Meanwhile, for Black American soldiers, the experience was deeply bitter. They were fighting to defeat fascism abroad while experiencing American apartheid at home. After the war, many Black veterans spoke about how they'd received better treatment in occupied Germany than in the American South, finding more friendship and equality in Berlin than in Birmingham. The tension between America's democratic ideals and its racist practices created cognitive dissonance that affected everyone involved. For German prisoners being taught about democracy and equality, American racism demonstrated the gap between ideals and reality. Some saw this as proof that American democracy was hypocritical. Others recognized that democracy was an ongoing struggle to live up to stated values, that imperfection didn't invalidate the system, but revealed the necessity of continued improvement. The re-education program couldn't hide these contradictions, and trying to do so would have been futile. Instead, they became part of a complex education in what democracy actually meant. Messy, imperfect, contested, but capable of change in ways totalitarian systems were not. As the war ended and repatriation began in late 1945, the question of whether re-education had worked became urgent. American officials desperately wanted to know if the program had succeeded. They conducted surveys and questionnaires, asking prisoners about their attitudes toward democracy, America, and Germany's future. The results were mixed. About 74% of surveyed prisoners left with positive views of democracy and friendly attitudes toward Americans. But scholars later argued that most adult prisoners hadn't undergone genuine ideological transformation. Their fundamental political beliefs remained largely unchanged. What the surveys likely measured wasn't conversion to democratic ideology so much as appreciation for decent treatment and pragmatic recognition that cooperation with Allied occupation authorities would be advantageous. The most effective argument for democracy wasn't lectures or newspapers, but visible American affluence and generosity. Prisoners compared the wealth, food, freedom, and technological advancement they witnessed in America to the devastation and poverty they knew awaited them in Germany. The demonstration effect of a functioning democratic society was more persuasive than any theoretical argument. Captain Robert Kunzig accompanied the first shipload of Fort Eustis graduates on their journey back to Germany. As their train crossed the border into what remained of the Reich, Kunzig watched the prisoners crowd to the doors for their first glimpse of home. Then they saw, and they'll remember for all time, Kunzig later wrote, ruin, desolation, and destruction were framed in that open door. Whatever lessons the re-education program had taught, the sight of Germany's devastation delivered the final crushing blow to any lingering faith in Nazi promises. Physical destruction, not a new enlightenment, Kunzig concluded, had obliterated the complex social conditions and ideological values that had nurtured National Socialism. In other words, military defeat and its visible consequences taught what classrooms couldn't. Prisoners returned to a Germany that had lost everything. Cities lay in ruins. The population faced starvation. Infrastructure had collapsed. Soviet occupation in the East brought its own terrors. American occupation in the West offered relative security, but also difficult denazification processes. Into this chaos came over 400,000 former German POWs from America, most with at least some exposure to democratic ideas and American generosity. The question of the program's ultimate success depends on how we measure it. If the goal was comprehensive ideological conversion of hundreds of thousands of Nazi supporters into committed Democrats through re-education courses, the program clearly failed. Most prisoners' core beliefs weren't fundamentally altered. If the goal was reducing violence in POW camps and preventing Nazi militants from terrorizing anti-Nazi prisoners, the program succeeded reasonably well. Separating hardcore Nazis, distributing Der Ruf, and empowering anti-Nazi voices made camps safer and more manageable. If the goal was creating a core group of intellectuals and opinion leaders who would help shape post-war German reconstruction, the program achieved remarkable success. The influence of Fort Kearny alumni like Anders and Richter on German literature and culture through Group 47 alone justified the entire enterprise. If the goal was demonstrating to German prisoners that democracy could work and that Americans weren't the barbaric enemies Nazi propaganda had portrayed, the program succeeded brilliantly. Most returning POWs carried home positive impressions of American society. About 5,000 German former POWs eventually emigrated to the United States, and thousands more returned to visit. The connections forged during captivity lasted lifetimes. Perhaps most importantly, if the goal was planting seeds that would help democratic values take root in post-war Germany, the program contributed to a larger process that ultimately succeeded beyond anyone's wartime expectations. Germany did become a stable democracy, though crediting this to POW re-education would be absurd. Multiple factors mattered more: total military defeat, Allied occupation, the Marshall Plan, Cold War pressures, and Germans' own determination to build something better. Yet the re-education program played a small part in a larger transformation. The returning POWs brought with them first-hand knowledge that democracy could work, that former enemies could become partners, that Germany's future might look different from its past. In September 1946, the last buildings at Fort Kearny and Fort Wetherill were abandoned or sold off. The Navy repurposed Fort Getty. The little camps that had housed the Idea Factory and attempted to change German minds faded from public memory. For decades, few Americans knew the story. The sites became footnotes in World War II history, overshadowed by bigger battles and more dramatic events. But in Germany, the legacy lived on. The writers and artists who had produced Der Ruf continued their work. Group 47 shaped an entire generation of German literature. Former prisoners wrote memoirs about their American captivity, almost universally praising the treatment they'd received. Alfred Anders, the prisoner who'd feared death when transported to Fort Kearny, became one of Germany's most celebrated post-war novelists. In a 1978 letter, he said the treatment we received in American POW camps was excellent and a truly humane experience. Hans Werner Richter used his Fort Kearny experiences to fuel his lifelong commitment to democratic culture and opposition to authoritarianism. Other graduates took positions in German civil government, education, and media, bringing with them perspectives shaped partly by their time in American custody. When historians began researching the re-education program in the 1970s and 1980s, they reached varied conclusions. Ron Robin, in his book The Barbed Wire College, was harshly critical, arguing the program was dominated by American academics pursuing their own intellectual interests, rather than understanding what would actually reach German prisoners. Arthur Smith, in The War for the German Mind, was somewhat more positive, seeing it as a bold experiment that, while flawed, represented a humane alternative to simply warehousing enemies until repatriation. What's undeniable is that the program represented something unusual in military history. Instead of treating enemy prisoners purely as security threats or labor resources, American officials attempted to engage with their minds and beliefs. Instead of assuming all German soldiers were irredeemable Nazis, they recognized political diversity and tried to empower democratic voices. The program's methods, using culture, literature, and ideas rather than force, reflected American liberal values, even as American racial practices contradicted those same values. The contradictions, limitations, and mixed results make the story more interesting, not less. Real historical processes are messy, complicated, and rarely achieve clean narrative arcs. The story of German POW re-education matters today for several reasons. It demonstrates that even during total war, combatants can recognize shared humanity and plan for reconciliation before fighting ends. It shows the power of decent treatment, how simple human kindness can undermine enemy propaganda more effectively than any lecture. It illustrates the challenges of changing deeply held beliefs, the limits of re-education, and the importance of demonstrated alternatives rather than imposed ideology. It reminds us that cultural and intellectual engagement can be forms of resistance to totalitarianism, that newspapers, books, films, and discussions can matter as much as weapons in long-term struggles over political values. The collaboration between anti-Nazi German prisoners and American officials to challenge Nazi ideology from within represents a retry. This response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue. The collaboration between anti-Nazi German prisoners and American officials to challenge Nazi ideology from within represents a fascinating example of what we might call soft power warfare. The battle for hearts and minds that continues long after guns fall silent. To understand how this played out in individual lives, We need to look beyond statistics and examine specific prisoners whose journeys through the American re-education system left documented records. Consider the case of Franz Bacher, an Austrian artist and leftist intellectual who had been imprisoned by the Nazis before being forced into military service and sent to North Africa. Captured and brought to the United States, Bacher ended up at Camp Stark in northern New Hampshire, a logging camp where prisoners cut timber in the White Mountains. Life at Camp Stark was harsh, back-breaking labor in brutal winter conditions, yet it became known as one of the least secure POW camps in America precisely because escape seemed pointless. Where would prisoners go in the middle of a forest in winter? Many prisoners did try to escape from Camp Stark, but nearly all returned within days, having discovered that freedom in the wilderness meant surviving on berries and facing certain recapture. Bacher got farther than most when he attempted escape, but he too was eventually caught. What's remarkable about Bacher's story is what happened after. Despite his escape attempt, or perhaps because camp authorities recognized it was driven by desperation rather than Nazi fanaticism, Bacher was treated humanely. He began sketching portraits of guards and painting scenes of New Hampshire's North Country. Local townspeople in Stark, initially suspicious of having enemy prisoners nearby, gradually warmed to the POWs. Some brought small gifts to the camp. Guards occasionally helped prisoners meet their daily timber quotas. Bacher painted portraits for townspeople, and some of his artwork still hangs in homes around Stark today. When the war ended, Bacher was selected for the democracy course at Fort Eustis before repatriation. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been a political prisoner under the Nazis precisely because he supported democracy. Now his captors were teaching him about democratic values he'd already embraced and suffered for. Yet Bacher later said the Fort Eustis experience mattered not because it changed his beliefs, but because it restored his faith that democracy could work, that the values he'd been imprisoned for defending actually existed somewhere and functioned in practice. Or take the story of Heinrich Wolgast, a prisoner who remembered being shipped from Fort Riley, Kansas to Fort Eustis in 1946, where Americans spent 6 weeks, he said, indoctrinating POWs in democracy. Wolgast's use of the word indoctrinating is telling. From a prisoner's perspective, even well-intentioned re-education felt like propaganda, an attempt to manipulate beliefs rather than genuine dialogue. This tension ran through the entire program. American officials insisted they weren't imposing ideology, but offering education. German prisoners often experienced it as one-sided persuasion. The gap between American intentions and German perceptions created constant challenges. Hermann Dorn, another prisoner, recalled Fort Eustis as the place where POWs were classified as either Nazis or Democrats, a binary categorization that many prisoners found overly simplistic and troubling. The reality was far more nuanced. Most German soldiers weren't fanatical Nazis or committed Democrats, but ordinary men with complicated, contradictory beliefs. They might have supported some Nazi policies while opposing others, believed in German nationalism without embracing Holocaust ideology, or simply fought because they were conscripted and had no choice. Forcing everyone into Nazis or Democrats categories missed this complexity. Yet, from an administrative standpoint, American officials needed some way to identify which prisoners posed security risks and which might be receptive to re-education. The classification system, however crude, served practical purposes even as it frustrated prisoners who resisted being labeled. Some of the most powerful testimonies came from prisoners who experienced dramatic transformations. Jakob, the POW who called Fort Eustis the greatest thing that ever happened to me, represented the program's ideal outcome. Here was someone whose entire worldview shifted, whose faith in humanity was restored, who left American captivity as an advocate for democracy and reconciliation. After repatriation, Jakob worked with American military government in occupied Germany, using his Fort Eustis training to help rebuild democratic institutions. But for every Jakob, There were dozens of prisoners whose experiences were more ambiguous. They appreciated decent treatment, valued the books and films they'd accessed, perhaps questioned some Nazi propaganda they'd believed. But they didn't undergo conversion experiences or become democracy evangelists. They simply went home, tried to find surviving family members, and focused on survival in a devastated country. The program's architects tended to overestimate how much formal education could achieve, while underestimating the impact of everyday interactions. A prisoner might forget lectures about American constitutional structure. Still, he'd remember the farmer who invited him to Thanksgiving dinner, the guard who shared cigarettes and talked about baseball. This townsperson asked about his family back in Germany with genuine concern. These small moments of human connection accumulated over months of captivity, creating impressions that lectures never could. This became especially clear in the case of one prisoner named Conrad Sperber, who graduated from Fort Getty's intensive 8-week course in 1945. Sperber, 39 years old at the time, was enthusiastic about what he'd learned and eager to apply democratic principles in post-war Germany. But when he returned home in June 1946, he discovered that displaying his Fort Getty diploma was dangerous. Some Germans pointed at graduates as traitors, or ones who had to be watched. The Allied re-education Sperber had received, meant to prepare him for leadership, instead made him suspect in the eyes of fellow Germans struggling with occupation, denazification, and survival. This was one of the program's unforeseen problems. In the controlled environment of POW camps in America, anti-Nazi prisoners could safely express democratic sympathies. Back in Germany, especially in the chaotic conditions of 1946 and 1947, former prisoners faced complex social dynamics. In some communities, open pro-American sentiment looked like collaboration. Former Nazis who'd escaped serious punishment resented returning POWs who'd been friendly with captors. Soviet-occupied East Germany was particularly hostile to anyone associated with American democratic programs. A September 1946 WWII Army intelligence report tried to assess what happened to Fort Getty graduates after repatriation. It found that about 60% were employed by either American military government or German civil government in the Western zones. This seemed positive, suggesting graduates were getting positions where they could influence reconstruction. But it also revealed the limited scope. Of the 1,200 Fort Getty graduates, only about 720 were working in government or administration. The rest had scattered to private employment, returned to families, or simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. The report couldn't assess their long-term influence because it was far too early to know. The winter of 1946 and 1947 brought catastrophe to Germany. About 60,000 Germans, many elderly, died of starvation or exposure as food supplies collapsed, and another bitter winter set in. Allied occupation authorities struggled to provide basic necessities. The idealistic visions of democratic reconstruction seemed abstract and irrelevant when people were literally freezing and starving. Former POWs returning from America, where they'd eaten well and lived in heated barracks, faced survivors' guilt and resentment from Germans who'd endured the war at home. Some kept quiet about their relatively comfortable captivity. Others couldn't hide it. Their better health and weight compared to malnourished fellow Germans gave them away. The cognitive dissonance was profound. These men had been defeated soldiers, prisoners of a conquering enemy. Yet they'd been treated better than civilians in their own country, fed more reliably than their own families, given access to education and culture that Germans at home had been denied. What did this say about Nazi claims of racial superiority? What did it reveal about American power and values? Former prisoners had to process these questions while navigating the practical challenges of rebuilding lives in ruins. Some channeled their experiences into immediate practical work. Walter Schoenfeld, a POW who'd worked on Der Ruf, returned to Germany and became a translator for American military government, using language skills perfected in captivity to facilitate occupation administration.